try assembling the alpha version of version 7 of the OpenFlexure Microscope. This is pretty exciting for me. I've not done this before, and it's a good chance to test out Julian's instructions. I'm going to share the link on Twitter now. I'll apologise to anyone who joins me after this introduction, and I will apologise for the total lack of editing or curation here. This is really me trying it through in real time, and I thought it might be fun to take a video. Anyone who decides to tune in is pretty much a bonus. I'm just going to retweet this from the OpenFlexure account. Right, tweet sent. I will look forward to seeing many viewers suddenly pop up. Won't that be fun? So the version 7 alpha improves a bunch of stuff. Cable management, reliability, general build quality. It also includes some much better instructions. So one of the purposes of this live stream is so that I can check out Julian's excellent handiwork on the revised instructions for version 7. So the first thing I'm going to do is check the bill of materials to make sure I've got everything that I'm going to need. We start with the tools. So I'm going to need a number 1 Posidrive screwdriver. This will do, I think. 2.5mm Allen key, which I have here. That's the green one for future reference. Raspberry Pi camera lens tool. That's this little piece of plastic that comes in the box. 1 RepRap style printer. I have my my trusty Ultimaker here. Although actually, as you can see, I've already printed the parts because you really don't want to watch that on a live stream. An extra M3x8 cap screw, which I have. A heat gun for the heat shrink. I'm not going to do that part today. Precision wire cutters, which, well, I have my little snips. I also have a craft knife, which will do in their absence. I'm not going to do any soldering, so I don't need the soldering iron. And I've got my utility knife and wire strippers, although again, I'm not going to do the electronics today. There's some filament in the materials, but of course I've already printed my parts, so I'm going to skip over that. I have some oil. I'm not going to use the solder, and I am going to run out to my garage to grab the thread lock when I need it. We'll see if we get as far as the motors today. For the optical components, I need to check if I have my tube lens. I think I do. Condenser lens and a microscope objective. The electronics I'm not doing today. And then for the mechanical components, I've got my 3 brass nuts, which are these kind of gold looking ones. 15 M3 nuts. This is not 15 clearly, but I have a big box behind me. 8 stainless steel washers, which I've got there. 4 M3 by 25mm stainless screws, M3. 9 M3x8 cap head screws, that's these ones. 6 M4 by 6mm button head screws, that's these ones. 2 number 2 6.5mm self-tapping screws, which are not on the bench in front of me, but I do have in a little bag. And 3 Viton O-rings, 30mm by 2mm. They are also here, but not in shot right now. Here are 2 of them, and I'm going to grab the third. with the O-rings, it's generally advisable to make sure you've got a spare. And these are my dinky little self-tapping screws to mount the camera when the time comes. Okay, so the first step in the instructions is about testing your printer. But of course I've already done my printing, so I don't need to do that. But I do want to check the plastic parts. So what I'm going to need is the Actuator Assembly tools. That's these ones. These don't form part of the microscope, but they're very useful during the assembly. I'm going to need the lens tool, which is part of this big brimmed together print. The main body, which is this guy here. 3 feet. These are the feet. Apologies for not being in the same orange colour. The big gears, these are what go on the actuators. The cable tidies, or the caps for the cable tidies, are there. The Illumination dovetail is this one. The condenser arm I have here, which is printed together with some other parts. Sample clips, again, part of my big stuck together mass. The optics module is in black, and it's important that it's black because we don't want any stray light entering either through the plastic or bouncing off the plastic on the inside. I've got my cover for the Raspberry Pi camera module. I have the microscope stand, which is new and improved and much bigger, and it has a drawer for the electronics from now rather than stacking up bases. And I've got the 3 small gears, which are here. So, first step is to carefully remove the brim from all the printed parts with a utility knife. I usually start by just pulling it off first, as a kind of rough pass, and then I'll use the knife to trim off anything that still has brim stuck to it. That looks all right. So these were printed on the Ultimaker. With the exception of the main body, all of them just use the regular built-in brim, which is fairly easy to peel off. The main body should be printed without any brim or support material, but we've baked a brim into the STL file. And the reason we've done that is that it means we have just a little bit more control over where the brim goes. If you print the main body with brim in your slicer, what tends to happen is the brim kind of jams up some of the small gaps in the bottom, and because those gaps are pretty important for the mechanism, that can make a bit of a mess, and it's not always super obvious which bits of brim you need to trim out with a knife, and so sometimes that can result in you trimming bits of the mechanism, and then you need to reprint the whole main body, which is very frustrating. So instead we've got this, what we call the smart brim, which only goes around the outside of the shape. Some slicers actually do a pretty good job of this already, but rather than rely on specific slicer settings, we've baked this smart brim into the design, and hopefully that works a bit better. That's something where it would be interesting to get some feedback. I think the smart brim does a good job of making it easier and more reliable to print. But who knows, maybe it actually makes it rather more confusing. The cable tidies have a little bit of stringing in them. We're still working on the design for that to make it nice and easy to print. But we have prioritized done over perfect. That's why it's an alpha release. And you can see I'm just pulling some little stringy bits off with some pliers. I'm sure everyone has their own preferred way of removing excess plastic from printed parts. Right, this bit of brim, as you can probably see, hasn't quite peeled off correctly, so I'm just going to trim that with my little craft knife. I usually spec a scalpel when I'm in the lab, but that's largely because getting hold of a scalpel in the lab is easier than getting hold of a craft knife. everybody thinks I'm trying to sound very medical. But number 10 scalpel blade, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the best ways of getting Brim off a printed part. There we go, that's my cable tidies. Need to get the little stringy bits off this one too. Ideally without slicing my fingers. Let's not throw any parts out with the excess Brim. These are the sample clips. It should, in theory, be possible to print all of these parts without Brim, and I always used to do this. I've since changed my mind on that because using the Brim generally makes it more reliable. But if your printer is set up with a nice sticky print bed, you might find that you don't need the Brim, and that's great because that's less cleaning up for you. Right, let's pop the camera cover out, and then that's all of the little parts done. I did cheat by having some of them de-brimmed already. Ooh, I forgot to de-brim the optics module. Right, so we prepare the main body in the next step. So I'm going to get to that. So for this step, I want my main body. I need 6 of the nuts. That would be these. I need my extra cap screw. We'll see why in a moment. My Allen key. My utility knife and my wire cutters. So the instructions we hope are now nice and clear as to what you actually have to remove. I should probably do a screen share or something here, but never mind. So there's 2 images here that show the smart Brim is this bit around the outside, and then also note the little ties inside the actuator columns. And last but by no means least, there are these ties here between the legs of the stage and the inner body. I think we should probably highlight them a bit more clearly because it's probably easy to miss that. So the first thing is just to try and pull the Brim off. And if you're lucky, it will all come off nicely. There is a very, very small gap between the Brim and the body in the STL file. And depending on your slicer, that should make it print as a separate object with its own perimeter. And we just rely on the plastic kind of splodging out just enough that the 2 parts help each other stick, but it's still easy to peel off. There are instructions on how to make this work if you're using a slicer, Prusa slicer. Because if your slicer is too clever, actually it can stop the smart Brim working. Now, it's probably quite hard to see here, but there's a little bit of what we call elephant's foot at the bottom of the Z-axis mounting. So I'm just going to trim that off with a knife because that will help the optics module to sit more nicely. We should probably chamfer this. There's the part where I try very hard not to slice my fingers. I see some people have joined the stream. Welcome. I hope this is fun. It's the first time I've done a live build like this, or at least it's the first time I've done a live build with anyone watching. So I hope you enjoy. And sorry if it actually turns out to just be half an hour of me wittering. So I'm just removing the ties now that stop the legs moving. This is probably most easily done with a craft knife. You do need a little bit of force, which can be a little bit scary, but it's a good idea to make sure that you take it out at both ends, so there's no plastic left in there. And there you go. See, that's nice and clear. There are also ties on the other side, so there are 4 of these in total. You do want to be a bit careful not to accidentally hit any of the flexure hinges when you're taking these ties out. Clearly that would be bad news for the performance of the microscope. I'm really wishing I'd got myself a sharper scalpel blade before I did this. Right, so now if you look in there, you can see the ties are gone. There's a little bit of them left, that's fine, but there's no connecting plastic. And then lastly, I need to remove these ties in here. These stop the actuator column wobbling around during printing, so they're quite important to make it print reliably, because we don't use any support material in the print. As you can see, removing support material from inside here would be an absolute nightmare. So that's why we have these ties instead. Again, they're baked into the STL, so you don't need to do anything with them in the slicer, but we do need to remember to take them out before assembling the microscope. These ones are pretty hard to forget because you won't be able to get the elastic bands in. Right, so I have now removed all of the little support structures from my main body. The next step is to embed the mounting nuts. So there are 4 mounting nuts that sit underneath these holes. This is one of the changes since the last version. Previously we just tapped screws directly into the plastic, but this was a bit of a problem because it was very easy to strip those threads, and once you strip the threads there was really nothing you could do. So I'm going to push that nut into the nut trap. There's a little tool to make that easier, although actually for these ones it works well enough to just push them in. And then you can see here I'm looking at the corner of the nut, so it's there are flat sides parallel to the edges of the hole, and I can lift it up into the hole with this M3 screw. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I can tighten that up and give it a little extra tweak, and this will embed the nut in the plastic. So you can see here that I'm going to tighten that a bit further, and now the nut has completely disappeared. Julian is working on adding a torque rating for each of these screws, so that we can be really confident that it's properly embedded. But for now, if you just give it a reasonable tweak, it's quite hard to cause any damage by doing that because you're just compressing the plastic. But now it's embedded in there, and even if I give it a gentle tap, the nut still stays in. So I'm now going to do this another couple of times. Because we're not necessarily going to use all 4 of these. Usually you would just use 2 of them, but you don't always want to fix in advance which 2 you're going to use. So if we embed the nuts now, that makes it nice and easy to put the sample clips on later, and the unused nuts will just sit there in the plastic until you need them. That was about 3 turns, which makes sense. That's pulling it up 1.5 millimeters. Right, last nut in the main body. Get that one embedded as well. No, it's a good idea to hold the moving stage rather than holding the base of the microscope, because if you hold the moving stage, then you're not applying any force through the flexures, and the flexures are the part of the microscope that is easiest to break. Right, I've got my my 4 nuts embedded in the top, and so the last step is to embed the nuts in the Illumination platform. Interesting. There's just no image for that step. Fine. So this is exactly the same as I was doing on the moving stage, just in a different place. There appears to be a bit of spaghetti in my print, so I'm just going to pull that out with my needle nose pliers. Should probably list needle nose pliers as a useful cleanup tool. Right, and just to make sure that that's properly shoved home, I'm going to use the nut insertion tool to push that in. Then no, that isn't all the way home. Right, that looks better. I picked up the wrong screw, that'll be why. So again, I'm going to do the screw up. We're going to pull the nut up and out of sight into the plastic. Get that embedded nice and tightly so that it doesn't fall down later. It's not a big problem if it falls down, you can always put it back in. Nothing will stop you putting it back in later. It's just slightly annoying. So again, I'm going to shove this in with my nut insertion tool. The angle of these is slightly counterintuitive, which is why I'm looking for the top to see the threads. Right, after a little bit of jiggling, that's in. I'm going to tighten it as before to embed the nut in the plastic. And done. So that's me prepared the main body. Put that to one side. Next I'm going to do pretty much the same thing to the microscope stand. I apologise, I can't fast forward in real time. But maybe at some point if we edit this video it will fast forward here, so you don't have to watch me embedding more nuts in the plastic. It's just me making it up to the regulation 15 steel nuts in the kit. So again, we're just inserting the nuts in there, putting a screw in from the top, tightening it up, and then giving it a few extra turns to embed the nut in the plastic. And you can tell it's worked because the nut doesn't rattle as you unscrew. So if it's not properly embedded, then you can kind of feel that everything's a bit loose and wobbly. Once it's embedded in the plastic, when you unscrew it, the nut shouldn't move. Incidentally, I removed the brim from the microscope stand already. I did print it with brim. You'd think that having such a wide flat bottom, it should be super reliable, but actually it does often curl up at the edges. I think the wall tends to pull up on the edges of the wide flat base, and so having a brim, which is quite easy to remove, just helps keep everything nice and flat on your print bed. Right, last nut for this step. And done. I notice actually the instructions for the microscope stand have a few bits left over from the main body preparation, so we should probably fix that. Right, now the actuator assembly. This actually is the meat of the microscope build. So we're going to need the feet, the gears, the brass nuts, steel washers, and the long screws. So there's a very good picture of all the bits you need in the instructions. I'm not going to recreate it right now. The first thing we need to do is insert the nut. So actually that's much like we've just been doing. If your print is good, it probably just slides straight in, but I'm going to recommend using the nut tool anyway, and we'll see why in a minute. So that just holds the nut in place. You'll see I've started with the x-axis. It doesn't really matter which order you do them in, but this is what the instructions say, so this is what I'm going to do. So I've got my nut in place, and it's important to note that it goes with the corner towards us. That doesn't really show very well on the video, but you should have flat sides parallel to the sides that it's sliding in on, and the nut tool makes it easy to get it lined up correctly. The next thing we need to do is attach the gear. So we take one of the big gears and one of the hex bolts, put the hex bolt through the hole in the gear, and it should be, the head of the bolt should disappear inside the gear. You can put it flat on your table and push if it's a bit tight. Then we want to put two washers onto the gear, onto the bolt. And then, holding the nut in place with the nut tool, we put the big screw in. You may need to give it a little bit of a jiggle just to get it lined up, because the actuator column sometimes wobbles a bit. There we go. And then you can see I can just spin the gear, and that will attach it. Then, as before, we want to tighten this until the nut gets embedded in the stage. Now you have to tighten this for a while because unlike the other ones, this nut moves, so you can see that the hole has disappeared as the actuator moves, and the stage has now moved off to the side. So you keep screwing for a while. It will then embed the nut, and when you come back down, the nut has disappeared. Haha, it's a magic trick. Lovely. Right. You now have to do this another 2 times. Oh, sorry. The instructions say at this point I should unscrew it a bit more, and you can cheat by pushing to lift it up a bit, and add a drop of oil on the lead screw. This is really important. Please don't skip this step. your microscope will last a lot longer if it's got some lubrication on the lead screw. Should also feel much nicer to actuate. So I'm going to quickly move on to the next gear. Oops, picked up 2 washers at once. And it is also really important to make sure you use 2 washers. Because if you use just 1 washer, then that washer is grinding away against the plastic, which often leads to the plastic wearing, and the washer generally gets embedded in one side or other. So either the washer kind of fuses with the gear or it fuses with the body. If you have 2 washers, then they still tend to stick to the plastic, but that's fine because then you've got a metal-on-metal bearing, which works quite nicely. So again, I'm going to give it a jiggle to get it threaded into the hole. Sometimes it does take a little bit of wiggling about to get the screw in correctly. Screw that into the nut, and you can keep turning and just screw it tight. That's the official way. But actually, sometimes if you just give the gear a pull, that will do it more quickly. The important thing is that you end up with the nut embedded in the plastic. So if I do this, you'll see the nut is still hidden up inside the actuator. It's not visible. Right, so I'll now tighten these so the gear is sitting against the top of the actuator. No point tightening it further than that once the nuts are embedded. And I've got my gears in. And you see I oiled the lead screws already. Right, put the oil to one side. Make sure I leave the cap on for the sake of my workshop. Now, this is the really fun part. This is where we put the Viton bands in. Note that the instructions say you need to put the nut tool in here. That's not because the nut's going to come out, but it's because the band insertion process pushes up on the actuator. If I don't have the nut tool in there, you'll see the screw rises up, the actuator hits the top of its travel, and that's a bit of a problem. Whereas with the nut tool in, everything is locked in place, so it makes it much easier to get the band in. So to get the band in, we need our band insertion tool. It prints flat, and then we fold it into this U shape, and there's a little cap that goes on the bottom to make it a bit easier to handle. You then need to thread the O-ring through the foot. This is probably the fiddliest step. So you'll see here, it's going over each of the prongs. Note that I've got the X foot for the X axis. And then I can just push it through like that. So what I end up with is the band running through this little channel in the middle, and over each of the prongs either side. I can then pop this in here, and hopefully click. That should now have popped in. Now what I can see here is it clicked on one side, didn't click on the other side, so I can push that other side, and that should have it in. No, clearly I missed the other side. Oh, and I may be done here because it looks like the top of my actuator didn't quite print correctly. You see here, that is a little part of the hook at the top of the actuator. So I think my Ultimaker has failed me. Disaster. Right, that shouldn't happen. That is unfortunate, but I'm going to keep going and I'll assemble the other axes so you can see how it's supposed to work. So again, we've got to thread the O-ring. If anyone saw my last attempt, you'll see that it failed with the top of the Z-axis, so clearly I'm not doing well when it comes to the axis assembly. Right, I'll do the Y-axis next. So thread the band through from the bottom. And it's important to make sure the band goes over all of the prongs, and then put it into the Y-axis. The foot's deliberately a tight fit into the bottom of the base, but with a bit of persuasion it should go. Again, make sure the band tool is in place, and then click, click, and done. And so you can see here that the band is nicely inserted on both sides and held in place by the hooks at the top of the actuator. So I'm a bit sad that that hasn't happened for my X-axis, and that was just a printer malfunction. Which is unfortunate. And that's actually not a failure mode I've seen for a while. Doesn't help that this printer is a little bit unloved in my garage. Alright, I'm now going to do the Z-axis. The Z-axis is slightly different because it doesn't print exactly vertically, and that often means that any print defects that you get on the actuators happen on the Z-axis. But as you can see, that snapped in absolutely fine. No, it didn't. It didn't at all. Are we okay? No, this one has failed in exactly the same way as the last one I printed. You can only just see it in there, but the top of the actuator has snapped off. So I think this is my Ultimaker playing up again.